So in the previous video, I had to fix a bunch of issues with the shepherd's hut roof, issues that had accumulated over the course of the build. Well, of course, the same was true for the chassis, and these were a little more complicated. So again, allow me to remind you of the journey so far. The first job had been to get hold of some seasoned oak beams big enough for the task. These ones were from the same house demolition, and were just about large enough to get what I needed. To start with, I had to square them up and reduce them to size using a combination of chainsaws, lasers, electric hand planes, the surfacer, and circular saws to bring them down to a final size of 175mm high by 125mm wide, just managing to avoid the sapwood and other weak spots of the beams. Then I cut them to 2 meters length, the exact width of the chassis, and to reduce the visual weightiness of them, I marked a small radius and cut a narrow strip out of each side using the portable bandsaw for the curves. In between the beams go these chunky cast iron turntables that rotate against each other, and to keep them perfectly aligned, a steel kingpin runs through the center, which meant I had to drill some enormous holes through the beams. So again, out came the lasers to help keep the drill perpendicular, and I slowly made my way through the motions. Drilling long holes really is an art, and at this point in the project, I still had a lot to learn, but the magic is in the mistakes. For assembly, first the bottom turntable gets placed onto the bottom beam, then the kingpin is inserted from above, and the second turntable dropped down on top, and finally the top oak beam. Next, I had to attach the solid steel axle you can see here on the floor to the bottom beam. That involved cutting a 50mm channel in the bottom face, and then of course, more holes. This time I used a block to keep them perfectly spaced and perpendicular. Through these holes go the stainless steel U-bolts that clamp the steel axle to the oak beam, and it's a brilliantly simple and effective system, so long as the holes are good. Then I used a sled with a sloping top face on the thicknesser to machine up some tapered oak planks. These I cut into half-round shapes on the bandsaw, and they fit snugly into the gap between the oak beam and the cast iron turntables. The reason they're tapered is because the sides of the cast iron are angled, to help it release from the mold after casting. A few more holes for bolts to keep everything aligned, although I had to cut up some threaded rod as a temporary placeholder. And then I could drop the steel axle into its channel and knock the U-bolts into place, clamping everything together before lifting the 24-inch cast iron wheels into position. Everything lined up beautifully, but obviously this is upside down for ease of assembly. This is what it looks like the right way up, on some oak supports to stop it toppling over. It really did spin surprisingly well. So with the turning axle complete, I moved on to the 6 meter long green oak rails, which make up the length of the chassis. I ordered these freshly cut from the sawmill, but unfortunately for me, it was the height of summer, and the heat caused 2 of the rails to severely bow before I'd even collected them. They'd been cut straight literally the day before, and that's because green oak still holds its moisture, and as it dries, it shrinks unevenly, creating bows. With water still inside, they're also extremely heavy, and so the most pressing challenge was actually getting them back to the house. Thankfully, this man and his truck were available for a reasonable price, and although he struggled a bit on the hills, we made it back in one piece, and once they were offloaded onto the driveway, the 120 kilogram beams were now entirely my problem. The reason this all got a bit out of hand is that usually the sawmill takes a couple of weeks to prepare your order, but these they had ready within a couple of days, and I just wasn't prepared. So I hooked them up to the digger and dragged them into the barn before strapping them straight, as I had to leave the country. A few months later I was back, and there was a part of me hoping that when I released the straps, the beams would remain straight. Of course, when the straps came off, the bows were actually worse, and the real challenge began. I first had to reduce them from 150mm square down to 135mm, and the 2 rails you see here on the right were fairly straightforward, but the 2 bowed ones on the left required much more attention. The problem was that if I made a straight cut along this string line, I wouldn't be left with enough width in the middle of the beam. So I had to improvise, and the solution was to unbow the bow against its twin. Not fully, but just enough so that I could run a string line that would still leave 135mm width in the middle. The final dimension actually has to be 125mm, but they will continue to dry out and shrink over the next 5 years or so I oversized them now. With that point reached, I snapped the incline and ran my track saw along it. Then I released the straps, which turned my straight cut into a slightly curved cut with exactly 135mm width in the center of the beam. Once the outside waste material was removed, it gave me a physical edge I could then follow with the fence of my big saw, set at 135mm open. So after making this big cut with my circular saw, I was left with a beam that was still bowed, but slightly less than before, and at least now the right width and thickness. And in case you're wondering why I'm going into so much detail here, well, it's because this story is far from over, and you will need the full context. Anyhow, I then cut them to just under 6 meters in length, with a slightly loose chainsaw, and then used the portable bandsaw again to add some nice curved details to the ends. That machine does things no other tool can, but I've snapped so many blades now that the cost per cut is quite astronomical. So now I needed to connect the green oak rails to the seasoned oak turning axle. So, more holes. First I thought I'd try a couple of drill blocks with a 6mm drill bit. Oh my god. So that didn't work very well, and it took me about an hour to remove the snap drill bit. So then I switched to the tried and tested laser guided drilling like I did for the Kingpin, which is very accurate but really takes too long to set up, especially when you're on the uneven dirt floor of a barn and nothing's level. So then I tried mirror guided drilling, which is one of those genius techniques that you occasionally stumble upon. It's easy to set up and intuitive. All you have to do is make sure the long auger bit reflection stays in line with itself. If you're off only slightly, it's very clear to see. So I was able to power through the 20 holes quite quickly, but it took me well into the evening, and some kind of delirium kicked in. Freshly cut green oak just smells so good. Anyway, at this stage I could begin the very slow and heavy process of assembling all the steel, cast iron, seasoned and green oak. I've had to disassemble and reassemble this chassis more times than I can remember now, and you've got to keep your wits about you. The way it works at the back is that the outside rails rest on these cast iron brackets which come off the rear axle. Then there's another 2-meter long seasoned oak beam that is hung between them at the back, and this is where the 2 inside rails sit onto. Everything is bolted together with big 20mm steel bolts that I had to coat in grease to prevent them rusting in the green oak. The 20 holes I drilled all lined up nicely, and it passed the bounce test with flying colours. So I removed the supports which had been keeping the front axle upright during assembly, and finally I had a rolling chassis. If only I could actually roll it. No. So the next thing to tackle was a tow bar. First I made a design, guesstimating some measurements and angles, which gave me the rough information I needed to throw together a bending jig using bits of oak, steel bar and half an acro prop which was just slightly larger than the 50mm diameter of the tow hitch ball. Then I bought a long piece of 1-inch steel rod, cut it down to size and put the centre of it into a 2-burner propane forge. Fired it until it was red hot, whilst isolating the heat to only the section I needed by cooling the steel next to it with water, and then very carefully pulled it out of the forge and onto the bending jig which was mounted to the chassis. I slid on another acro prop which focused my bending force to an exact point. This was the key of all of it. And then with a little effort, pulled it around the jig. I actually had to overbend it and then add a rod to the jig to create a hard stop before pulling it back. All of this had to be done, obviously, whilst it was hot enough, so it was a bit of a rush. And after all of that, I was left with a nice hairpin shape, which was just narrow enough to put back into the forge to get it red hot again so I could fiddle it some more. So first I straightened it out a bit and then remounted the jig in a different position on the chassis to pull the ends apart to the correct spacing for the axle. Despite this being the first time I've ever tried forging, it all went fairly well, and then with a couple more bends for the feet, it was looking exactly as I'd imagined. So I mounted it to the turning axle using gate pins, and I now had a way to pull and steer the chassis from one single point. The best way to think of this steel tow bar is like rigid rope. You can pull it, but you can't push it, as I came to discover. Anyway, at this stage, I reversed the Land Rover in, hooked it up, and for the first time pulled the complete rolling chassis out of the barn and into broad December daylight. Its maiden voyage was a couple of loops around a wet field, and it was very satisfying to see that everything was working as it should. Even though there was a long list of finishing touches, I decided I could move onto the roof, which in hindsight may have been slightly premature, but we'll get to that later. The first task for this final video on the chassis was taking it all apart once again so I could clean it up and apply some oil, as it was starting to look a little dirty. I have a feeling this is going to be a good shot. Bollocks. Oh shit. That was really nice. Now that moment of zen is out of the way, let's talk about snagging. For those of you who've not come across the term, snagging involves fixing all the minor issues that present themselves over the course of a project. They're the little problems and mistakes that you think, I'll sort that out later, for the sake of making quick progress. As you can imagine, there was quite a long list to circle back to for this chassis, but when snagging creates more snagging, it can become quite frustrating. But it's become clear to me that these details are what you want me to continue documenting, and I've come this far filming them, so I couldn't abandon it now, even if it was quite slow. Anyway, ripping the paint off the turntable wasn't such a big issue. They needed a fresh coat of paint anyway. The main issue was putting grease nipples into all the cast iron components, but of course this required more holes, and once again there was a lesson to be learned. Snapped my drill bit. So if you're going to use a pilot hole in cast iron, it better be significantly smaller than the final drill bit, otherwise you'll catch an edge and snap the drill bit, as I did, twice. If you're freehand drilling into cast iron, it's much better to just go straight to your final drill bit size. But if you do find yourself in the situation of having to enlarge an already drilled hole, here's the magic trick that cost me 2 drill bits. Use the bigger drill bit, but in reverse, and slowly abrade the hole through. That way you won't catch any edges, just make sure it doesn't get too hot. Once the holes were drilled, I then used a tap to cut threads into them. Doing this by hand is also very challenging because you have to keep the tap perfectly in line to the hole, whilst pushing down hard to get it started. There were in fact a couple of holes that I had to re-drill again, so I could retry the threads as they weren't good. Basically, doing 7 of these by hand on non-flat faces was a steep learning curve. But the grease nipples now gave me a way to pump grease directly into the heart of the turning components, to help them run smoother and to push out any water, reducing the risk of corrosion over the long term. So repainting the turntables also gave me an opportunity to sand them back to see the true quality of the casting. Despite this very thin coat of filler, which seemed unnecessary, once I got back to the bare metal, I was very pleased with what I found. I then switched to the wire wheel to get into the little nooks and crannies, but sanding the cast iron back to bare metal was obviously not necessary. But it did make the turntables much smoother than before, so the final paint job will look a lot better. After repainting the turntables, I gave the wheels a quick wash, very quickly decided they absolutely did not warrant a repaint, and moved on to the next item on the list, to weigh everything. This may be the last time it's possible to do so before it's assembled, and having a clear understanding of the weight will be very valuable when I come to transport it. First up were the heaviest components of the cast iron, the rear 32-inch wheels, which came in at 67 kilograms, almost my weight. Then the smaller 24-inch wheels at the front of the chassis, which despite being only 25% smaller, were nearly 40% lighter at 41 kilograms. The axle brackets which support the rear of the shepherd's hut were next, coming in at 25 kilograms. The two cast iron turntables for the front axle were 28 kilograms each. And finally, the two solid steel axles were both 39 kilograms, which brings the total weight of the metal components of the chassis to exactly 400 kilograms. So then it was on to more snagging. Putting metal and oak in direct contact with each other comes with some dangers. And this was helpfully demonstrated to me the first time I put the chassis together, when I put the naked green oak directly on top of the cast iron brackets. When I took it apart after a couple of months, a chemical reaction had created iron tannates on the oak, extremely hard, scale-like plates which were quite nasty to remove. It's tannins in oak which actually make it such a durable and rot-resistant timber, because tannins are toxic to many bugs, fungi and microbes, even in moist conditions. It's the reason why oak is used for wine barrels, outdoor structures and boat building. But it shouldn't be in direct contact with cast iron, so I needed a barrier, something to stop any chemical reactions taking place. Cork is water resistant, compressible and chemically neutral, so it'll act as a physical buffer between the two materials, stopping any rust or tannates forming. As long as the cork's not constantly wet, it should last a very long time, so it's a great little solution. The solid steel axles are also in contact with oak, although this time the oak is seasoned so it doesn't contain much water and won't react as aggressively. But it was still a good idea to paint the exposed steel. I also used a thin layer of cork to separate the steel from the oak, which will help with any moisture control, as this part of the chassis is only a foot off the ground, so it will be fairly humid. So there's a variety of kits you can buy for building a shepherd's hut. Most of them have the cast iron wheels. Some of them have the cast iron turntables, but very, very few have full width solid steel axles. Instead, they come with stub axles, which are bolted onto the ends of the timber, and I think it's a big mistake. If you never intend to actually tow the hut, I can just about understand it, but otherwise it's a waste of time. It would be like comparing a Suzuki Jimny to a Land Rover Defender, but even that might be unfair to Jimneys. A full width solid steel axle underneath a timber beam takes advantage of the dynamic load-bearing properties of steel and the volume of timber to evenly distribute the weight. The reason I say this is because now that I've towed the chassis around an uneven field many times, as you'll see shortly, I can appreciate the forces involved, and I would not be comfortable doing it with stub axles. So yeah, if you're going to all the effort of building or buying a shepherd's hut, because let's be honest, they're not cheap, and you intend to tow it, avoid stub axles. There's no doubt that they're the weak point of the chassis. So then it was on to finishing the green oak rails. After taking off the sharp arises of the beams, I heated up some steel bar and seared the insides of the holes I drilled. This is an old school method of sealing up the fibers inside. It's not at all necessary, but I saw Engel's coat shop do it, and sticking something very hot into a small hole is incredibly satisfying. With all the oiling, painting and caulking finished, it was at last time to reassemble the chassis, but not before weighing the 6-meter oak rails. So how much do you think these bad boys weigh? $81 kilograms, which together with the rest of the oak totaled 430 kilograms. Add that to the 400 kilograms of the metal components, and the final weight of the rolling chassis is officially 830 kilograms. And then once you add the 190 kilograms of the roof, it's over a ton of material I've been picking up and moving around for months. So this is what the chassis looked like finished, or at least cleaned, oiled and painted. The oak sparkled. You may notice that the tow bar looks a little bent here. That was from when I tried to reverse the chassis. Like I said earlier, the tow bar is like rigid rope. You can pull it, but you can't push it. When I need to reverse the chassis, I instead wrap a long strap around the rear axle and pull it while someone steers from the front tow bar. And if you look very carefully, you may also notice that the green oak rails aren't very straight anymore. Another minor issue was getting the nuts on the rear axles. I had to buy this extra large wrench to fit the enormous rear nuts, which measure 74 millimeters from flat to flat. But even then, because they're nylocks, I couldn't turn them fully by hand. Jesus. What I need is 2 of these without the nylon, but I don't have that. Rather than busting a gut trying to do them up and then maybe have the hassle of undoing them, I made up some plywood spacers. These stop the wheels moving towards the ends of the axles where the sharp threads could cut into the bored holes of the wheels. Obviously they're temporary, and when I do the final assembly of the shepherd's hut, I'll have to figure out a way to tighten the nuts fully. That's good. Now before I move on to the final challenge of the chassis, let me once again tell you about the wool sweater I've been developing and which is now for sale over at kotoworks.com. It is by far the greatest sweater I've ever owned, and that's because it's made from 100% British lamb's wool. If you've never had the good fortune of wearing a garment made from this material, you're missing out. It's nature's answer to cold weather. Incredibly warm, yet very breathable. You can wear it again and again without having to wash it because the wool is actually antibacterial, anti-odor, and moisture regulating, all because of the lanolin, a natural wax that is present in the fibers, so it stays fresher for longer. It has a great ability to resist flattening, so the sweater actually stays the same shape and retains the same elasticity and bounce even after years of use. Like I said in the last video, I've worn this exact sweater hundreds of times, and unlike the other wool sweaters I own, it doesn't look tired or worn out. Based off the sales so far, I'm fairly certain these will sell out by the end of the next couple of videos, so this is also a warning that if you're interested, now is the time to act, as I don't know when I'll do another batch again. But when ordering, do make sure to double check your chest measurement and order the same size, i.e. if you have a 42-inch chest when puffed out, order the 42-inch size sweater. Now back to the chassis. At long last, all the little bits and bobs were taken care of, and so it was on to the main snagging event. the final chapter of my struggle to wrestle these green oak rails into shape. Here we go again. As you know, it took not a small amount of work last year to reduce the severe bows on 2 of the rails. But as you can see by the number 1 rail on the left, the bows have returned with vengeance. And the scene was set for one final confrontation. The state of affairs was thus: the number 1 rail, the worst offender of all, kinked sideways, bowed up, in what is a classic twist. Sod's Law has dictated that this is the side of the hut that I want to put a double door and 2 windows on. Just wonderful. So I need to do something about that. Number 2 isn't so bad with a slight curve but no bow. Number 3 is the best of the bunch with a small curve and no bow. Number 4, although bowed upwards, looked like it wanted to stay straight, but because I had strapped it across to the number 1 rail for last year, it was overpowered and ended up with a slight kink in the middle. To summarise, all 4 of the rails now had curves going the same way, resulting in the chassis itself having a curve to it. Although I'd noticed what was happening to these rails in real time, there wasn't much I could do about it as I'd been focused on building the roof on top of the chassis. And you probably know by now that I don't actually live in France, so my time here is limited. But I had at least put together a few ideas for how to straighten the rails out again. The easiest thing to fix was the upwards bows. This wasn't a new development, and to level out all the rails evenly, all it needed was another horizontal seasoned oak beam in the middle of the chassis. First, I used this temporary one to clamp all the beams down and get everything in the right position. And then with some straps, I was able to pull the beams together until the width of the chassis was exactly 2 meters in the middle. This is identical to how I'd strapped up the chassis whilst I'd been working on the roof. But as I just mentioned, the problem was that the sideways bow of the number 1 rail was so severe that it actually pulled the number 4 rail on the opposite side with it, which, like I said, looked like it wanted to stay straight but was overpowered, giving it this weird kink in the middle. I was skeptical that the new horizontal beam would fix all the problems, but nonetheless I thought it could at least improve the situation, as it is fixed to all 3 of the other rails, not just the number 4 on the outside. This is the actual beam I intended to use, and of course it's made from another of the reclaimed beams and has some absolutely stunning end grain. As you can see, I'd already drilled all the holes, and so unlike the temporary beam already mounted, this one would set each rail exactly spaced apart, so I at least wanted to fit it to see if it would help the situation with the severely bowed number 1 rail. Unfortunately, even though I could get all the bolts in and everything spaced out perfectly, the chassis itself was still curved, although I didn't get a good shot of it at the time. The bow on the number 1 rail was just still too strong, but there were a couple of tricks left to try. So I switched the best rail, number 3, to the outside, which is where I want to put the 2 windows and a double door, shunted number 2 into the number 3 position, and number 1 to number 2, but that is much easier said than done. So with the rails in their new order, I had a much straighter beam on the outside, on top of which it will be much easier to install the windows and doors. But it still didn't address the overall curve of the chassis. Every rail still had a leftward kink, giving the entire chassis a curve. So there was only one thing left to try: rotating the worst rail, number 1, 180 degrees, so its bow was now in the opposite direction. Instead of 4 against none, it would be 3 against 1, an equation I hoped would delete the issue entirely. Unfortunately for me, this meant the 15 or so holes I drilled through it for the various bolts I planned were now in the completely wrong locations, and I had the much harder task of re-drilling the holes on a heavily twisted timber on uneven ground with no 90-degree reference points, no mirrors, no lasers, no drill guides. The only option was freehand. It was the final challenge this chassis threw at me. The technique was simply to drill halfway through from one side, using only my eyeballs to aim it straight, and then flip it around and drill halfway through from the other side, hoping they would connect roughly in the center. Somehow, they came out perfectly, which shows that there really are no finer teachers than well-made mistakes. So then with the horizontal beam already fixed to the other rails, I could use clamps to force the bowed rail straight and insert the bolt. Instead of adding to the overall curve of the chassis, this actually helped straighten out the other rails, as it was in the opposite direction to their bows, and it was 3 against 1, so a much fairer fight. But clearly there is a huge amount of horizontal tension being contained here, which, if I remove the clamps, would only be held by the 4 vertical bolts. So I wanted to add another system to capture some of this pressure, essentially replicating what the clamps are doing right now. Unsurprisingly, it required more precise holes. Into the holes we're going to go some 1 meter lengths of threaded rod and a very expensive array of stainless steel washers, nuts and connectors. Square and round washers, simply because I thought it would look interesting. So I think this is pretty self-explanatory. The 2 connectors in the middle allow me to add an additional short length to extend the length of the threaded rod, which only comes in 1 meter lengths, and I needed just over 2 meters. And the washers and nuts simply keep the rails from moving sideways, relieving the pressure on the bolts.
Oh, God.
I locked a couple of nuts against each other on each 1 meter length, so I had a way to rotate the rod, and I decided to do 2 of these systems halfway between the 3 horizontal beams, just to allow a bit more control over the rails. So basically the middle oak beam helps keep the rails the same level, and then the stainless steel rods hold the rails in their straight positions, and it is quite a precise system in fact. Something I will note is that you can't move the rails simply by turning the nuts on the rod, that just strips the thread. Ask me how I know. So you have to use clamps if you want to adjust them, and then tighten the screws before removing the clamps. Everything has to be stainless steel, of course. As we've seen, zinc plated hardware just rusts in green oak.
Yes!
And that was that. The rails were now level and straight. So did I make a mistake not fully finishing the chassis to instead focus on the roof? Actually, I think not. The forces that created the bows were inherent in the beams, and allowing them to emerge like this gave me the information I needed to correct them in a way that otherwise may not have been so obvious. So I probably would have had to rotate the bad one around anyway. That is the nature of working with green oak, and it's why the normal way to build a shepherd's hut these days is not like this, but instead on top of a welded steel chassis. But the performance is not the same. The fact I was able to bend these oak beams straight again demonstrates just how flexible they are, and they need to flex if they're going to be towed over uneven ground with hundreds of kilograms of walls, roof, windows and doors on top. There is no suspension system on a shepherd's hut, so it's these timbers themselves which need to absorb the forces instead. Also, it's been the perfect project for me. From the pinpoint accuracy of drilling the kingpin holes in the reclaimed beams, to the chaos of using free of heart green oak for the rails, it's been a valuable learning experience that I've got a lot out of, and almost every detail and mistake has been documented to a degree that has bordered on obsession. So I hope you've got a lot out of it too. But one minute you're the cock of the walk, and the next you're a feather duster. And it didn't take long before I got myself into another pickle with the chassis, which has quite a wide turning circle. Also, as you can see, I'm doing very well physically. The injections I started at the end of last year for my autoimmune disease have been incredibly effective, and so have reduced my inflammation by like 90%. As you can imagine, my entire life has improved. There were moments last year where I struggled to see how I'd be physically able to complete this build, days where I could barely get up off the ground, so I'm immensely grateful to have access to these injections. But you know what makes getting this chassis stuck on this turn even more idiotic? Is that I had done the same thing literally a week before when towing the chassis out. I just don't know what to say about that. So that is the chassis finished, the roof finished, and at long last I can move onto the walls, which must be the easiest part of the build, right? Well, you'll find out next week. And don't forget, if you want to buy a sweater or beanie, go check them out at kotoworks.com. They won't be around for long. Thanks for watching.